Okay, we will go ahead and jump in here in a second. We've got a few people you can see out in the lobby rolling in. Here comes one important person, my wife. I don't know what the deal is, but we're a very left room heavy, my right side heavy group. That's what I'm saying. No one sits over here. Rob comes in and sits over here. Occasionally the winds will like throw me off and they'll wander in somewhere random, but that's about it. We'll strike that from the record. Travis is out today. He wasn't feeling well. But hopefully we've got a couple of people online. I know Rob, he gives me a reason to look to the left. Otherwise it would just be like fake. Like I'll just glance over here.
It really ruins like the cadence of like when you're speaking.
I want to like look around the room. But if
you keep doing that, you're looking at an empty space.
Yeah, that's right. So I have to train myself to not, I guess.
There's got to be some reason.
Is that good, Mark? Right, did I move to the wrong spot? Am I too far up?
You're
Okay. Okay. I got you. In a second, would you mind getting the door? No rush on that, but just at some point. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I did all the work myself. I had no part in that whatsoever.
He was out there blessing the parking space yesterday.
Yes, I was out there just touching them to make sure they were all. I'm glad they noticed. We're raising them well. So, right there. A little mascara. That's right. We put our mascara on this week. The parking lot. So. I don't know. That's a mom thing. I don't know. That does sound like in the lobby. Unless ours escaped. Okay, so today we're actually getting into like the first real depth of apologetics. So this is going to be, Mark, can you turn me down just a hair? That'd be great. Thank you. I can hear myself too much. That's perfect. Thank you. We're going to be kind of getting into like the argument for the existence of God. And so I've given you a sheet of paper here that's just got all kind of 6 major things listed out, or reasons listed out. People have argued over time for the existence of God. So we're going to just kind of run through those one at a time. Some of these we're going to be really in depth on, and some of these we're going to like have like a paragraph to talk about. I mean, like very little. So just kind of take whatever notes you want or don't. That's okay. I just want you to be able to kind of follow along with what we're talking about. And so, first kind of question, just to kind of get us started. Who here has ever had a conversation with someone like arguing for the existence of God or talking about whether or not God exists? Like, what was that like? What are some of the things you said to them or they objected to? How did that go? So how did evolution play into that? Because to me, that sounds more like an argument against a biblical view of creation than it does against God. Like there could be evolution and still some sort of being that exists outside of that. Okay. So. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Any other, so who else in conversation about the existence of God, what are some arguments or things people have drawn from? Okay. So from your perspective, like the watchmaker argument that sure, but like because there's a finesse here, things fit together too perfectly for it to just have fallen into place. Yeah. Okay, so the existence of evil. Why is there evil? Okay. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but like the flip side of that no one ever seems to make any sense of is that evil in a lot of ways makes sense. Like, chaos theory, like things are going to get worse, right? And things are going to act in eccentric ways. The thing that makes no sense is, why is there morality? Like, evil existing seems like likely, right? If you throw out 1,000 scenarios of how the world's going to go, evil is going to be in all of those, right? The oddity is that there's universal morality. That makes no sense. So, we're gonna, yeah. No, exactly. Yeah, that's my point. Yeah, it's the thing people throw out is like, well, how is there evil in the world if there's a God? The question we should be saying is, how in the world is there morality if there's not? That should be the driving part of the conversation. So for today, like I said, we're going to actually get into kind of some nitty-gritty actual apologetics. So the goal for understanding these 6 theories of why God exists, these are 6 theories that have been used over time, some better than others, and some more simple and some more complex. One of them so complex we're not really going to get into it, because it's really just mind-boggling and frustrating to think about. But we're going to kind of cover these just so you have some things in your back pocket. Maybe one of these really resonates with you. Maybe a couple of them do. That you can say, if I'm having this conversation in the future with someone about why I think God does exist, or even how I know He's the God of the Bible, then these are going to be some of the things you're going to get into. And these aren't specifically we're going to talk about some scripture that go along with these, but this isn't a biblical defense of the reasons for God. It is a kind of philosophical defense of why God exists, to be able to have that conversation. So then you can jump into why we believe Scripture is true. But that'll be a different week. So today is just kind of the theoretical, really big philosophical ideas of why do we think God exists? What do we see around us that points us in that direction? So we're going to talk about these 6 things. There's probability, creation and design. And so I meant to print this in color, so that's why they're shaded oddly. Those were red, and they stood out nicely, but you got the bad version, sorry. Creation and design, anthropopic arguments, arguments from immaterialism, transcendental argument, and ontological argument. So these are all, the name really is irrelevant. The ideas of what we're going to kind of talk through. So the first of those is probability. That really faith in the supernatural is plausible and really more plausible than the alternative. It makes more sense that there is a God that created everything than the opposite is true. So it makes more sense that you would believe that a God had something to do with it than you would believe something else. So the point of that is that there's a misconception that people of faith generally, and Christians specifically, our brand of faith, tends to be kind of lent towards fairy tales, or we believe in these big myths and that sort of thing, that we're just a people who kind of stuck our head in the sand and we want to keep believing in Santa Claus kind of perspective. And so that is it's kind of what people believe about us, that we've kind of turned our head to facts or to science and to reason, rational thinking. But I think we have to ask ourselves, what does it really mean to have faith? What does it mean to decide to believe in something or not believe in something? Because I think here's a kind of a bottom line for that kind of question as it comes up. It's in order to live in the world, we are all required to exercise some sort of faith. We have to have faith in something. Everyone practices faith somehow. We exercise faith every day by using 3 tools, really. This is the way we make decisions according to faith, believing in something. With reason or science, with intuition, and our experiences. People make decisions every day based on what they believe about these things, what they believe about their experiences, about their own intuition, and about what they believe the facts are saying in front of them. But it's important that we use all of these tools when considering questions of ultimate importance. We want to use all of those tools. Many people, when talking about matters of faith, decide that only the observable, knowable, scientific information can be used. That's the only realm we can draw from when we're making decisions or we're thinking about things. But I think that creates an anti-supernatural bias kind of right out of the gate. If people argue that, well, then they're throwing these other things out that they also use themselves. They draw on their own experiences to make decisions. They draw on their own intuition. My gut tells me this is true or not true. They're using those other things, but then when it comes down to matters of faith, they want to act like we're not allowed to anymore. And so that's kind of something to point out in these kinds of conversations, that they're most likely people aren't limiting themselves in their life choices to the things they're trying to put on to believers when talking about the existence of God. And so it can become a kind of evidence-centric approach to talking about this, but that's really a false reality. They don't actually live in that all the time, but they're trying to kind of put this conversation of the existence of God into a box that they aren't themselves walking in or living in. So, for example, I think a student at like Princeton religion class can talk about the life of Jesus, but his assumption, if he starts that conversation and kind of sitting in this like intellectual bubble sort of environment, he starts the assumption that Jesus isn't God, right? Like that's kind of his baseline assumption there. And so then everything he talks about was going to be the things Jesus is saying must be metaphorical, right? Like the things he's saying must be just an illustration. He's trying to make a point about something. They're not real. They didn't actually happen. But it's because he's starting with the assumption that Jesus isn't God. So he's already kind of like has this anti-supernatural bias because he's talking about we only want to look at things in the evidence that we can see. And so I think the point of this kind of first argument is that we all have faith in something. And we all use different things like our experiences. We all use our intuition to make everyday life decisions. But when it comes to the matters of quote-unquote faith, people want to have that conversation as if these other parts of our life don't factor into the way we live. But they do. And so I think this isn't so much like a really convincing argument for the existence of God, as much as it is to say, hey, the game that someone might be bringing to the table is rigged already. They're coming with an anti-supernatural bias, or they're coming with an evidence-based approach that isn't actually how they live the rest of their lives. So like, for instance, like the student who is arguing that Jesus is just kind of a mythical figure, well, if you're coming to the table with an anti-supernatural bias, you've already slanted the game in the wrong direction, right? You haven't come really actually looking at an open discussion. You've already come kind of with your perspective rigged. And so it's something to point out that people, they are using faith in their lives. They're just trying to not in this conversation. So again, some of these are going to be really in-depth. Some of these are just kind of like, hey, this is something to think about that shapes the conversation. That's more one of those. The second thing is creation and design. Creation and design. This is one of the ones that probably you're more familiar with. It gets brought up a lot. Creation by an intelligent designer is more intellectually plausible than by random chance. So how did everything start? What is the origin of the universe? There's two basic answers to this question. Either the universe is self-created and it's just always existed and we've kind of come to this point in time because things have just fallen that way, or it was created by something. Those are the only two options here. And the question is, which view do you have faith in? It's not a matter of science versus faith, but a matter of faith versus faith. Naturalism assumes that the origins of everything began through time and chance. A very simple equation. Impersonal force, call it what you will, energy, atoms, matter, whatever it may be, plus time, plus chance equals creation, equals existence of things, right? Like, if it's all out there, you give it enough time, give it enough energy, give it enough space to do its thing, then it's going to create something. But what's the probability and likelihood of this creation coming about through that equation? Like the world we know now, what's the probability of that? Well, if you just look at the most, like take away trees and beauty and take away sunsets and take away like all these things and just look at like the basic building block of life, which is like a single strand of DNA. If you just look at the probability of that coming about, it's something to the 364th like billion power. I mean, it's like just this astronomically low chance of actually producing something. Of all of this just matter and space and energy stuff floating around, like it is just the tiniest of possibly conceivable chances of things happening in the world that it would all line up to get what we have now. And so it's actually, let me see if I can remember the stat that I saw on this. I think it was something that even if lightning, because they're looking for like something that like gets this started, even if lightning like struck this primordial soup that we all started in like every second for like 8 million years, it only marginally like makes it more probable that that would happen. Like if you like introduce like there's just this gigantic force of energy every second just constantly hitting this like collection of matter and energy, that it's still just this astronomically low probability of chance that we would ever create anything out of that. That something would, from all of that energy, form into what we have as DNA. And so people are believing something. They're believing that like the craziest odds in the universe could line up with what we have right now, right? And being able to point that out, that like there's not any kind of scenario we could run that would recreate the original like Big Bang or whatever you want to call it. There's nothing we could do that would give us reliable data to say this actually could happen. So they are choosing to have faith in this incredibly low probability when there is another option that actually makes a lot more plausible sense. And that's just the kind of the simplest thing there. So the point of that is just that it does take faith to believe in a purely naturalistic explanation. You have to have faith in this just insane probability coming about. So at a minimum, in this kind of, if that's someone's argument, that like evolution or whatever it may be, is the way that they're like, well, this explains everything. Well, like, at a minimum, if you can believe that through random chance and evolution, that this is how the world came to be, and it's such a small probability, there ought to be sufficient evidence that a creator is also possible. Like, if they can say, based on the science that I'm looking at, that it has this insanely low probability, I can have faith in that, I can believe that's going to be true, they ought to also be open to say there's also another explanation with actually probably a lot more evidence, or at least circumstantial evidence, to say it opens the door to, if you can believe the evidence points to this, you ought to be able to believe there's enough evidence to point to an actual creator of some kind, some sort of intelligent designer who could have made the world. So that's kind of a starting point, just to kind of get them thinking through those things. If they can believe in this crazy low probability, they ought to be able to believe in a natural designer. And so the teleological and cosmological arguments are that there is specifically, there's kind of in the notes there, specifically that there is order to what we see, that things just work together too well, right? So that's the teleological argument, that like there's too much inherent beauty and design and all these things in creation for it to just randomly happen. Like maybe we could have gotten a single strand of DNA. There's no way everything functions perfectly the way it does. There's no way like even just Earth like exists. It's like, oh well, of course we live on the planet that can sustain life. It's the only one that can. But it's just not. There's just no way that, like, even just getting one strand of DNA, there's such an nth degree of possibilities, like the low probability. The teleological argument states that like things are just too complex. They fit together too perfectly for that to just randomly come about over time. It just, the probability of that is just, it's so low, it's incalculable. And then the cosmological argument is the first cause argument. They're like, because everything exists, something had to start it, right? Like those are the kind of the two ways you can take that. Like, so you start the conversation with like, it's kind of insane that you are clearly having faith in this low probability. Like you're choosing to believe that that's possible. If you'll suspend your disbelief in a creator for just a moment, you'll see that things are too complex and something had to start it all. Like where did all of it come from if there wasn't a first source? Something had to be the first kind of creator of that. So those are kind of the two ways to branch off of that conversation about creation and design. Okay, anthropic arguments. These are fundamental aspects of human nature and human experience are best explained by the existence of God who created this way. So this is the one that we'll spend a little bit more time on. This one and the next one, I believe. And so there's several forms of this argument. Most often it focuses on human conscience, religious experiences, or the sense of yearning for eternity and the human capacity for good and evil. So this is just kind of looking at what it means to be human, the way we experience the world, and saying, because of what I'm experiencing and you're experiencing, we have these kind of joint shared experiences as people, clearly there must have been a God that organized us in this way, that created this experience and existence in all of us. So Kind of one of the first lines of thinking is ethics, morality, and conscience. A world ordered by moral lawgiver, some kind of divine person, some divine being that set forth what is right and wrong, is more humanly satisfying and explains human life better than the alternative. So all humans have a conscience. We have a sense of right and wrong. Every culture in human history has upheld beliefs about right and wrong. We may have disagreed at times over kind of exactly what's right and exactly what's wrong. And people have had different versions of that to some extent, but that's usually once you get away from like the kind of center, right? Like murder, stealing. Like there's things that have just universally are always wrong. And that has been true in every civilization and over time. It's like, it's far more humanly satisfying to say there's a reason that cultures that have never interacted with each other throughout time and space come to the same conclusions, and that's because imprinted on them from God is a moral law, some sort of conscience, some sort of sense of this is right, this is wrong, this is good, this is bad. Like something has been imprinted on us externally, and so someone has done that to us, right? And so where did this sense of morality come from? And so as before, if you're talking about where this sense of morality comes from, you have two choices, either from God or from within creation. We just naturally developed a sense of right and wrong, and so everyone is born with it. Now, there are people who who very seriously argue that our sense of conscience does come from evolution or instinct or social constructs, that essentially morality was just created over time as we needed a way to develop social constructs with one another. We had to have a social contract. Like, if we're all going to be here together, we have to kind of agree on what's right and what's wrong, and that's where our morality has come from. There are people who argue that. But the problem with that is that theory, taken to its logical conclusion, then there's not an external what's right and what's wrong that exists that we're all kind of ascribing to, but we've just decided among ourselves what's right and wrong. So taken to its logical conclusion then is that anything that we right now say is wrong, if we agree that it actually benefits us, we can change that to being right. We can just decide we don't agree, we don't like that anymore, right? But that falls apart quite quickly. So there was a professor at Princeton named Peter Singer. Anyone heard of him? Have you heard of him? You're smiling. Okay, so he argues that ethics should be balanced by measuring the happiness, maximizing best interests of society. So essentially, he argues that ethics should be measured, that you measure it by the happiness, maximizing best interests of society. So happiness maximizing, so like what makes us happiest, what makes us most well off and better as a people, and how do we maximize that? That's what determines what's right and wrong. Things that lead us away from happiness as a people are wrong. Things that help us all are better. So stealing, if we all can't trust each other, then that's going to lead us away from happiness. We probably shouldn't steal, that sort of thing. That would be his viewpoint. But his conclusions, taken to their logical conclusion, he ultimately argues that what we should do then is that, let's see if I can find my notes on that. He ultimately argues, there it is, okay, commit infanticide. So he essentially says that because children that are born with special needs of any kind, or just less likely to thrive, or aren't going to contribute to society as wholly as others, they're going to make it difficult for parents and society to care for them, that we should kill them in infancy. So if a child is born with Down syndrome, a child is born with malformed limbs, or then like they're worth less to society and we don't need them anymore, right? Like that we should just do away with them at birth. So that's ultimately what he argues, is because these people that aren't contributing to our greater happiness in some sort of measurable way are no longer necessary, right? And so he argues for this kind of eugenics, essentially, at birth. The problem is that it's emotionally dishonest. And we can reject it because it actually doesn't play out in real life. People don't see life this way when it comes down to it. And so even Professor Singer at Princeton couldn't bring himself to live this out. His mother got sick with Alzheimer's, and she was unable to care for herself, and was unable to do anything to contribute to the moral happiness of society, the maximizing happiness of society. She no longer played a role. But what did he do? Did he argue for her to be put down? Not at all. He actually couldn't bring himself to even like put her in any kind of like care unit. He begins to care for her himself. Like he couldn't emotionally actually live out what he was arguing for logically. And so people that are even the greatest proponents of this kind of theory, that like, well, if someone's weighing society down, we don't need them anymore. When faced with it themselves, they actually can't live in that. It's not how we're really wired. And so people who are ascribing to this like in a theoretical way, when push comes to shove, can't walk in it because that's not how people are. And so people don't actually they don't come to a conclusion about what's right and what's wrong based on what makes us happiest. If his theory was true, then he would have had no problem just sending his mother away into the book The Giver and just down the chute. Like that would have been what would happen. Like but he couldn't actually, because people aren't wired that way. We have more of a connection to life. We believe life is more valuable than we might logically argue at times. So relativistic morality will not satisfy our desire for justice and fairness, and so it should be rejected. Any kind of argument that we have just developed morality over time and we can change it depending on what we desire is best really doesn't play out in real life, and so we can reject that. People throughout time and space have just lived as if some things are right and some things are wrong. We didn't develop that in ourselves, and so that must mean there's some sort of external force, some sort of being, some sort of lawgiver that created in us a sense of right and wrong. We appeal to this higher standard because one exists. So if we have a desire for justice and we generally know the difference between what's right and what's wrong, we have to ask ourselves, where did that come from? And that's kind of the way you can have that conversation with someone. Is like if they themselves think that things are right and things are wrong, that you need to ask them, like, why do you think that? Where did you just create it? Is it just a social construct? Like, if we all just decide we're going to be a murderous, stealing society, is that going to then be okay? Like, and they're going to ultimately say no. Like, there's something within them is going to push back against that because we don't actually live that way. People aren't wired that way because there is a God. Second kind of way we can see these anthropic arguments playing out is religious experience and yearning for eternity. Yearning for eternity. Our desire for ultimate meaning and for eternity points to our need for a relationship with God. So this is one of my favorite kind of subsets of arguments in apologetics. Humans are incredibly difficult to satisfy. We're really impossible to satisfy. Nothing ever does it fully, right? Nothing ever fully quenches those things within us. And that's a universal experience. The atheist, Jean-Paul Sartre, I'm not sure how you say his name, that's probably wrong because it's French, said, there comes a time when one asks, even of Shakespeare, even of Beethoven, is that all there is? Not as well versed in the classics, the Rolling Stones summarized this near universal experience slightly differently. I tried and I tried and I tried, but I just can't get no satisfaction. That's right. And so, but that same idea. Now, Solomon in Ecclesiastes probably says it a little bit better. There is nothing new under the sun, no new novel ideas. The satisfaction of work and profit is temporary. Material possessions and pleasure are unfulfilling. And he ultimately says death comes on all of us. So, and he concludes, and Solomon does, saying that the world is meaningless, utterly meaningless, chasing after the wind. And so there's something in us that is wired to be satisfied, right? Like, and we have to ask ourselves, where does that come from? Why do we have this hunger for more? Why are the things we look at, like, why can you go to the ocean and sit on the beach and stare at the ocean, and eventually you get tired of it? It's no longer new. Like, the Grand Canyon is overwhelmingly beautiful, but if you lived on the edge of it, it would become commonplace to you. It would cease to be satisfying and interesting to you. It would no longer be beautiful in your eyes. And so we have to ask people, like, where did that come from in them? right? Where have they felt that sense of meaninglessness or emptiness or longing in themselves? So you might get a few answers. You can get an answer that says, I'm not satisfied. Someone, you could ask them that. If they've ever felt dissatisfied with something, they're going to say, no, I'm not satisfied with everything in my life. And then at that point, if you can kind of go down this logical road with them of like, have you ever felt meaningless or ever felt dissatisfied, or are you fully satisfied now? And they can admit, like, well, no, I'm not. Well, then ask them, like, well, what would that be that would fully satisfy you? Like that, what would be the thing that matches that yearning that you feel within yourself? What would be that thing that is enough, finally and fully? Well, of course, probably aren't going to have great answers to that. So you could, but that would be the point where you'd be able to kind of say, like, I think you are made for God to be that thing, right? Like that would be the logical part of that conversation. Or if they're kind of skirting around that direction, you can also ask just what next questions, like to help them get to there. Like if someone is kind of pushing back on, like, well, then, my life's pretty good. You do another thing after that. You do another thing after that, and like you just kind of, life is a succession of one-upping the last experience you had in order for chasing satisfaction. Well, then you just keep asking, okay, well, what next? Like, all right, well, you had a great weekend. Okay, well, what's next? Okay, you've gotten the bigger house. Okay, what's next? You have the second house. Okay, what's next? What's the next thing that is going to satisfy? And ultimately, there's nothing that will, right? There's no amount of fame. There's no amount of money. There's no amount of lack of work or relationships. There's nothing that they can think of that's going to be ultimate. Everything is eventually going to let them down. And the point of all of that kind of like way of having a conversation is to get people to see that they are made for more. They have a natural bent for more. And every other part of our human experience, all of our desires, everything we long for, everything we want, has a way to satisfy it. If you are hungry, you can eat and no longer be hungry. Like this like innate thing that if we're like saying we evolved, right? We'll say, okay, we'll put that in there. All of your natural desires have a way of resolving themselves. If you're tired, you rest. If you're bored, you go read something. You go do something. Like there are ways to satisfy, to cease the longing for every other desire that we have within us, right? Everything else. There's nothing else that doesn't have a natural, physical, or mental way of satisfying that longing in us, except for this one. There seems to be something in us on top of hunger, on top of rest, on top of whatever else it may, relationships, like there is something else in us that keeps longing for more. We need something greater and bigger and grander and beautiful. Like we ultimately, even if you stare at the Grand Canyon, you get bored. Like we need something even better than that, right? There's something in us that longs for it. And if that's the case, and every other desire in us has something that meets that need, surely there's something that also meets that need in the universe for our longing for more as well. Like if we are a evolved species and we've been just happen to fall into the way we are, where did that desire come from? Where did that desire come from for more? Unless there's something out there that is intended to meet it, right? And so to me, that's one of the most intriguing arguments for the existence of God, because everyone's going to relate to that sense of dissatisfaction. There's always going to be something in them that wants more, something bigger and greater. Where did that come from, if not a God that perfectly meets and satisfies that need? Yep. Yeah. That's going to be a different week. So, yeah. There are arguments that tie into these that have to do with the existence of God of the Bible. But we'll cover that later. I think that's somewhat of a separate question that's a much harder conversation. But if you can get someone to the point of, okay, yes, God exists, well, then you can start talking about what are the nature and character of that God and qualities of that God. Like we Christians hold that God is a self-revelatory God, that he made us not to hide himself, but that we might know him. And if we know him, then he has revealed himself to us. Well, now we've at least narrowed it down to, okay, well, God has revealed himself. How has he revealed himself, right? If we can start going down that chain, and then we can start looking at how we think God does and has revealed himself and what that looks like. and why we think Scripture is the truest form of his revelation. Jesus himself is the truest form, but the Scripture is what we have currently. So, but that's a veracity of Scripture question, not a generic God exists question. So this is this is a great way to kind of get a handle on this question in a postmodern setting, because people tend to not care a lot about facts and statistics and like those kinds of things. They just everyone lives their truth. They like, this is what I've experienced, whatever. Well, so this argument draws on people's experience. It draws on, okay, well, we don't have to talk about like what's the probability of things happening, like, because the most unlikely thing that could ever be could happen. Like even if there's just the smallest of chances, there is a chance. So that could be the right answer. Whereas people historically were probably a little more convinced that like that's not likely. Now people are more they're going to argue from a place of personal experience and emotion and those sorts of things. But this one draws on that, which is one of the reasons I think I like it so much, is that it asks people to, okay, based on your own experience, you've never been satisfied. Like, surely there's something out there then. If you developed, however way, you developed a sense of longing for something, that must be because there's something that meets that need. And so that's a way to kind of get that conversation started. Our desire, points to something beyond the world that we live in. Third kind of way of kind of arguing through this one is similar, is that there's a capacity for good and evil. Capacity for good and evil. Human nature is most consistently explained by the Christian view of man, created in God's image, but born as sinners. So why do people live the way they do? Individually, we can have such extreme thoughts of encouragement and discouragement in our minds. Like we are a people that can have a desire for good, but yet do evil. Like we are complex in that way. We are, as a race, we are given to actions that can characterize both extreme good and generosity and care for fellow man, and the most heinous atrocities that we can imagine. Right? Like as a people, we are capable of doing either of those things. And so we have no problem understanding how a mother might sacrifice her own life to save a child, or how a firefighter can climb up a burning building to save someone. But at the same time, we have to admit that we also, people historically, have done some evil things. And so we are able to do either one of these, and it comes from something within us. Well, this is where Christianity makes the most unique and profound statement about the nature of God and man. Because Christianity states two things about mankind. First, that we are made in the image of God. And second, that we have rebelled against him in sin. That our worldview, as we're arguing for a Christian worldview here, is that if this presence of good and evil exists in the world, we have a coherent narrative as to why that is. Whereas others, religions, don't. Or even the faith of science doesn't. As to why people, because if we are, let's say we are just like it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, then it doesn't make any sense for the firefighter to go rescue the person in the building. Why would he risk his life from an evolutionary standpoint for that person? Where did that desire come from? Why would a mother, because if you look at animals, right, like mothers often like eat their young, and so you have to like keep them from doing that. Well, why would a human mother, if we're just one step higher up on their evolutionary totem pole, why would that person sacrifice their life for their child? It makes no sense. You can have another kid. Like, why would you make that choice? There must be something in us that is desiring good, that cares about things, that is as a sacrificial impulse in us, right? A loving impulse. Or you could say the other way, if people are inherently good, then where does evil come from? Like, if people are inherently worthwhile and we're just a good race and people sometimes make mistakes, well then how do you get the Holocaust? Like, how do you get mass genocide? How does Rwanda happen? Like, what happens because we're also evil. And so most people's worldview only accommodates one or the other. People are either inherently good and they don't really have an answer for evil, or people are inherently good and they don't have an answer, are inherently evil and they don't have an answer for good. Why would you do that? Like, most worldviews only accommodate one or the other, whereas the Christian worldview has a very concise, defensible answer for both, is that we were made in the image of God. He imprinted his nature on us, but we rebelled against it and we broke that. And so we have both kind of at work in us as people. So Christianity reconciles this tension with this concept of sin. And so therefore, while we are saddened by evil and sin, we're never surprised by it. We understand that apart from Jesus, we are all by nature rebels against God, which means that we would rather do things our way than God's way. Like that's inherent within humanity. Apart from Jesus, all of us choose sin. And so we're never surprised by evil. But we also believe that there is a way for that to be redeemed, that because of Jesus dying on the cross, God can punish sin and forgive us who have done it. And so we see a reconciliation there, that there's because if God didn't do that, he would be unjust, right? Like if God just was like, well, I'm just going to let them kind of take a slide on this, like we're not going to worry about the problem of evil. Christians have a way of saying God actually cares about the fact that we've rebelled, and he punishes sin. He deals with it. He's not unjust. But for those that experience the forgiveness of God because he has punished the Son, they can actually be redeemed and forgiven. They can have that goodness in them kind of shine through, and the Lord will actually kind of tamp out that evil over time. And so for us, we have a way to reconcile these differing things that are going on within humanity. And we have a reason for it, and we have an answer to how it kind of gets tied up in the end. So that's another argument. The existence of good and evil, that we have the propensity for both, is another, I think, helpful argument in terms of the existence of God. Like I said, most people, they're going to argue for one or the other, and there's not really any other worldview besides Christianity that has a good explanation for why both seem to exist side by side. Any questions on those, the anthropic arguments? Okay. Yeah. I mean, but that even if you take the locus of the problem off of individual people and put it on society, there's still a question of like, then why is society broken? They don't have an answer. Yeah, there's not an answer for, because then society is either itself a thing that is driven by some sort of outward force. Yeah, or you get back to it goes back around full circle. It's like, well, society is made up of individual broken people. And the ultimate kind of caveat to that, or like catch to it, is that if you find these same problems even in indigenous remote societies. So like even if you, like the people are always like, well, how does God, send the person who lived on a remote island and never heard the gospel, how does he send them to hell? This like, perfect person. Well, that perfect person doesn't exist. The person who lives alone, they're born and raised and die by themselves on an island. How that happens, who knows? But however that would work, like that person still is going to sin. And so that person's not blameless before the Lord. They do still deserve the wrath of God because they're still sinners. The Bible says that even there's enough of God in creation that we ought to understand him and know him and love him and follow him, and yet we rebel. And so even if you've never heard the gospel, you have no idea what God's word says about what's right and what's wrong, you're still in a remote island going to be a sinner. And the same thing is true on a societal level. These indigenous peoples that have never had outside contact with the rest of the world, their societies still form around sin because they're formed by people in sin. It's not like worldwide society has like infected this little like tribe in Indonesia, like on some remote island. That little tribe in Indonesia or wherever else it's going to be is also going to be a group of sinners, even if us, the bad Western world hasn't like infiltrated them yet. You find that everywhere. Like there's, I can think of the famous like Christian team like Nate Saint and what are the rest of their names? Say it again. Jim Elliot, thank you, who were all killed trying to take the gospel to this people who, upon first contact, murdered them all. Like they were out of their own self-protection and self-defense. They chose to kill rather than to have a conversation. Like, they're sinners. And no one from the outside world had ever had any contact with them. Like, they had no long-term relationship. No one had affected them, but yet their society was warped by sin. And that's the question they can't answer with that. Like, when people would say it's not individuals are fine, it's society, well then it's chicken or the egg at this point. Either way, there's still a force of evil somewhere at work in this that started it. Yeah. And none of these are going to, like, no one comes to believe in God because they were argued into it. Like, we need the Holy Spirit to work in us and lead us into that. But these are things that you can help kind of prod people to think about things. So you can, hey, what about this? It's like the next one is argument from immaterialism. And that's basically kind of it really could be a subset of anthropic arguments. But essentially, if humans we ascribe to things like beauty and love. We ascribe to these things that seem to be immaterial forces at work in the world that we can't really understand, but people have common experiences. Like, everyone knows what it is to love and be loved. We have some sense of that. Either that's parent, child, friends, brothers and sisters, spouse, like whatever it may be, you have some sense of that. People have an ability to see beauty, right? And it's universal. It's not like there's 10% of the population sees beauty and everyone else just doesn't care about it, right? But like, universally, people understand that things can be beautiful and they can be captivating. Like, where does that doesn't in any way like fulfill some sort of evolutionary need in us. It's just part of who we are. We see beauty and behold it. Like, it captivates us. That's an immaterial thing in the world that we just collectively understand and experience. And so where did that come from? Apart from there being some greater sense of beauty, some greater source of love, some greater source of what is right and wrong. Like, these are all kind of the same arguments. Like, we find these things in creation. We find these things in existence that we have no logical reason for them to be there, right? But yet they are, and they're universal. And so where did they come from? Well, they came from some sort of outside force that created them and implanted them into us. That designed us in that way. Argument from immaterialism. And so we ask people, like, okay, then if we are just a purely, pragmatic people, we only have done the things that have served us, then where did beauty come from? Where did our appreciation for love come from? Like, how did those things enter in? And so that is another argument to make. The ontological argument, or the transcendental argument. Sorry, those are backwards on my notes here, but I've got them. Let's see. We'll do ontological. This is a tricky one, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on it because it comes from a guy named Saint Anselm, and he wrote a book called the Proslogion, and it is painful to try to read through, but have at it. I've got a copy in my office. And his basic argument boils down to this, that God is that which nothing greater can be conceived. If the thing you can think of that's best in the world, that could exist, that whatever that may be, his argument is essentially boils down to, like, whatever that that being would be God, and to exist is greater than to not exist. Therefore, that being must exist. Again, it's convoluted. So the people that pushed back on him on this he had a guy around, a contemporary of his, that essentially argued, well, then what if I apply that to the most perfect island imaginable? That if I just conceive of in my mind the most beautiful, perfect, untarnished island that could possibly exist in the world, then it necessarily would exist. It must be on earth somewhere, because if to exist is better than to not exist. So that island somewhere is in the world, but it's perfect. Well, Anselm's retort to that was he's only talking about things that are necessary for existence, or must necessarily exist, and an island must not necessarily exist. So he's it really only works if you're willing, this idea of what God is or who God is only works if you're willing to say you have a starting point of like there must be some sort of force out there. Does that make sense? So like if you're willing to concede that there must be something like a first start, like you use one of these other arguments like creation and design, the teleological argument or the cosmological argument to say something had to start us all. This all is existing too perfectly for there not to be something. If you're willing to concede that point, then Anselm's argument works. But it doesn't work unless you're willing to concede that point, because then you get lost in this perfect island retort that he got caught up in. And so if someone's willing to say there must be something out there, then Anselm would say God is what is the greatest thing you can imagine. That he is always better than whatever you might say. So if you say, okay, well then is a powerful God out there, okay, it's better to be powerful than impowerful. So God must be powerful. It's better to be more powerful than all other things than to be less powerful than something. So God must be more powerful than all other things. It's better to be perfectly good and flawless than to have a flaw. So God must be perfectly good and flawless in all things. It's better to be eternal than to have an ending point. So this is his argument. So he begins to ascribe the nature and character of God to saying God is better than what can be imagined, and it's better to exist than to not exist. Therefore, that's also a quality of God that he does exist. It's a really long, convoluted argument. And he weaves in there ultimately that people ought to believe in him because it's dumb not to. Essentially, he boils it down to essentially kind of saying that if you can imagine this being existing and you have hope and faith and all these things in him, it just seems more logical to believe than to die and be wrong than it does than to just not believe and die and be wrong, right? He was like, it just makes more sense to just go ahead and believe this, so y'all should. And so I don't know how persuasive he was to a lot of people, but that's Anselm's ontological argument, is that God is the greatest being which can be conceived, and because it's better to exist than not exist, therefore God does exist. But the caveat there, the trick is that you have to concede that God is by necessity must exist. There must be some sort of force that does exist. And so he's arguing really against a broad spiritual power sense. So someone might be willing to say, there's probably some sort of good force out there. There's some sort of being that we can't know. There's something out there like that. Anselm's argument kind of leads you away from that to, no, you actually know the God of Scripture. That's kind of the road he's leading you down. Because it's for instance, part of his argument would be that it's better that you can know God than to not know God if he exists. So if you can imagine a being that's perfect and mighty and powerful, well, it's better to have a relationship with that God than to not. And so if that's a better quality, God is always those things which is the better quality. So God must be a God who reveals himself to us and makes us able to know him. And so his argument would kind of push back against those people that are like, oh, God's just some sort of force or being out there. You're like, well, that's a pretty crummy God that's out there, then if that's the case. And he's not actually the best being we could conceive of. So if he's not, if that's our version of God in our head, there must be something better than them even above that. Because if I can think of it, then I'm, in some ways, I have more power than that God does. And so that would be his kind of convoluted roadmap to trying to get you to come to faith in Christianity. It's one of the most widely discussed, written on topics in philosophy of arguing the existence of God. Probably more than any of these other things, that has been the one that's been most highly debated and written by philosophers, because I think partly just because it gets them into the weeds on lots of crazy stuff. But so I think there's something there. But that's one that's really tough, and it's not going to lead someone from a there is no God to God existing kind of argument. You got to have that first step. The last one is the transcendental argument. So how do you know anything? Modern and postmodern philosophers cast more and more doubt on our ability to know. First about the supernatural, and then about anything at all. These philosophers of knowledge, operating in an increasingly secular framework, have come to argue that it is not possible to know anything with certainty. But does that really explain our experience of knowledge? We all feel like we know things. Everyone thinks they know things. We live our lives as if knowledge were possible and useful. And in fact, that belief seems to be born out of when we successfully act and make choices on the basis of things we know. Like people bring in information and they make a choice, and it seems to go according to the information they brought in. Like we can make wise choices. So it must be that knowledge then is real. And if knowledge is real, if we can know things, where does it come from? If we can have information and actually act on it, there is truth that can be lived on. We can order our lives around things that are true. Then the Transcendental Argument argues that God is the precondition for knowledge, for logic and for science and conceptual generalizations. That God made the world, He knows all the facts of the world, He made us to be able to interact with facts of the world, to also know the world. He made us capable of knowing things because God knows things. That our knowledge comes from somewhere, and our ability to interact with knowledge comes from somewhere. And so in a current postmodern world where people just essentially disbelieve that we can know anything, which is the current state of culture, that everything is relative, right? My truth is my truth and your truth is your truth, and we can't really know anything. Well, then people don't actually live that way or believe that. Plenty of people believe there are true things, right? That things can be communicated and known and acted on. And so if we can get people to set down their postmodern ideology, which is terribly flawed, for long enough to agree that there is knowledge, this would be the argument that says, if there is knowledge, then the ability to know things came from somewhere. There being knowledge in the universe came from somewhere, and that somewhere is God. And so almost all of these are taking some aspect of things people experience or see or know and pointing back to, if this is here, it had to come from somewhere. Like knowledge and truth had to come from somewhere. Love and beauty had to come from somewhere. The existence of creation had to come from somewhere. Like almost all of these arguments argue back to that kind of line of reasoning. It's a matter of, in a conversation, picking which one someone's going to be most susceptible to say, what's the thing, whether it's beauty or love or in knowledge, whatever it may be, what's the thing that they are willing to say, okay, that you're right, that had to come from somewhere, that there's no way, good, wrong and right, whatever it may be. Almost all arguments for God kind of circle that drain. Okay, well, it is 10 o'clock. We're going to break for today. Like I said, this was probably one of the headier ones. It's going to be one of the more fundamental kind of pieces of apologetics is the arguing for the existence of God. I think some of the others will be a little bit less intellectual, but not a ton less. So it is apologetics. All right, we'll see you guys in about 15 minutes. Thanks.